Okay, U.S. Chapter 22, Section 3, Foreign Policy Troubles. How successful were Ford and Carter's foreign policies? So we're going to compare the policies of Ford and Carter towards the Soviet Union, the changing U.S. policy in the developing world or third world countries, the successes and failures of Carter's foreign policy in the Middle East. So when we look at Ford, he is going to continue the policy started by Nixon following détente. So he meets with Brezhnev in Helsinki, and they signed the Helsinki Accords. One of the things that many Americans and foreign policy experts are hoping is that he will push Brezhnev on some of the human rights abuses. And so you see this cartoon of FDR and Stalin in the background, the Yalta Agreement, and then you see Ford and Brezhnev with the Helsinki Confirmation. And so the cartoonist has the viewpoint that this is not going to be in the best interest of the United States, that it's going to benefit the Soviet Union more than the United States. But he also continues and works on the SALT II treaty, which is going to further limit arms and further move the world away from nuclear weapons. At least that's the hope of the SALT II treaty. One of the things that you see is with the fall of Vietnam and the attack of the Khmer Rouge, this is going to displace all kinds of people. And so these people are known as the boat people, as they get on these rickety boats and they are hopefully sailing to a better place to live. Up until the current Middle East crisis over the last couple of years, it was the largest migration by sea in the history of the world, and that has been outdone here by those people fleeing Syria and Iraq and some of those places in the most recent times. So again, if we look at how the American people are feeling and what things are worrying them, in March of 1977, it's still inflation, cost of living, unemployment, energy. Those are the big things. You also see other domestic issues, and international issues have really shrunk to the point where Americans really aren't concerned with that. They see other things as being much bigger problems that need to be dealt with. Carter comes in and he's going to try and continue this policy of détente. It's not going to go very well simply because so many things are going to change. SALT II is heavily debated in the Senate, so even though it's Ford who's the one that kind of negotiates SALT II, he hands it over to Ford to finish the job. And Congress sees this as making the United States too weak, and they're afraid that Brezhnev is being too aggressive, and so they don't want to limit arms. They want to maybe even increase them as a threat to the Soviet Union to show that we're pretty serious about all of this. What really breaks this down is in 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and that is a game changer. So what Carter adopts is sanctions. He refuses to sell grain to Russia. One of the impacts that's going to have is that's going to be a contributing factor to the 1980s farm crisis, are these sanctions against the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan. And the other thing that happens is the U.S. boycotts the Summer Olympics in Moscow. We don't send our Olympians, as well as most of our allies, don't send our Olympians to Moscow to compete in the 1980 Summer Olympics. Now, the other thing that Carter really changes course on.
Please stop in the office. Cassidy Folks, please stop in the office.
The other thing that Carter really changes course on is how he looks at third world countries. Prior to this, they were seen as pawns in the game of the Cold War, where they were either going to join our team or join the Soviet Union's team. Now what he's more concerned about is working with countries who treat their citizens well. And so he's going to withdraw support of dictators, those people who treat the people in their countries poorly. So in Latin America, some of these Latin American dictators that we've been propping up over the course of the last several decades, we're going to withdraw our funding and our military support to them, and that's going to cause some problems. So because of that, it's going to get mixed results in Latin America. because again, some of these countries have been propped up simply by the United States and the fact that we have been sending them money and weapons, and they were using that to prevent communists from coming in. But at the same time, they crack down on freedom of speech, freedom of press. They do some horrific things in Latin America, and Jimmy Carter just isn't going to support that. When we look at Cuba, he negotiates this Mariel boat lift where we are going to get people out of Cuba who don't want to be there. The problem is that Castro is going to use this to unload some of his prisons. Now, most of these people who are prisoners were political dissidents. They were people who criticized Castro and didn't like him. And less than 20% of the people in the Mariel boat lift are prisoners anyway. And of that, the vast majority of them are political dissidents. So you're only going to get a small percentage of people who are criminals. Now, the problem with that is that 1, 2, 5%, whatever it might be, that's enough to freak Americans out. And so this is not popular in the United States whatsoever. And the Mariel boat lift ends up getting returned or sent back because the United States wouldn't accept them. The other thing that he negotiates that's pretty controversial is returning the Panama Canal to Panama. We had it ever since it was built. We had a 100-year lease on it or something like that. And Jimmy Carter is working to get that returned back to Panama sooner or quicker than the original treaty. Which was pretty controversial at the time because we wanted to continue to kind of have control over it and make sure that it was kept safe. But it ended up working out regardless, I guess. Some successes and setbacks. He's able to actually get Israel and Egypt to sit down, Camp David Accords, and hash it out. And Egypt and Israel become close working allies and friends. And that's a game changer in the Middle East for us. Now, on the flip side, Iran is going to seize American hostages and hold them hostage for 400 or some days, whatever it takes. It's a really long time. I just remember it being on the news every single day for a really long time when I was growing up. And this is because in 1979, the Shah, which we had propped up and kept in power in the 1940s and 1950s, comes to the United States for cancer treatment. And that's when the opponents to American supported Shah, are able to take over Iran, and they take 66 American hostages. And all of a sudden, what we begin to think is that the Middle East is the biggest threat to U.S. foreign policy instead of communism. So January 1981, inflation, cost of living, again, is in the forefront of Americans' minds, unemployment and energy. So 1981, we're going to go into another little recession, and that's what's going to really dominate Americans' minds and worries.